Well, I'd like to begin by thanking the Tiger Squadron for that great flyover. As President Reagan used to say, that is the sound of freedom. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. I'm Fred Ryan, Chairman of the Reagan Foundation Board of Trustees. And before we begin the program, I'd like to recognize some special guests that are with us today. I'll start with several members of our Board of Trustees. They include Kathy Bush, Robert Higdon, John Rogers, Ben Sutton, and former California Governor Pete Wilson. Please join me in welcoming them. And also today with us is former Congressman Elton Gallegly and his wife Janice, two terrific friends of the Reagan Library. Thank you for being with us. Captain Lawrence Vasquez, Commanding Officer at Naval Base Ventura County. Thank you for joining us. And of course, Duke Blackwood is Director of the Reagan Presidential Library. Duke. I'd like to begin by giving a special thank you for all the men and women who are here today from the Marine Corps bases at Camp Pendleton who've helped us so much with today's celebration. This is the 10th year that the Reagan Library has been working with Camp Pendleton to pay tribute to President Reagan on his birthday. And we are honored to have the support of the brave men and women that defend our freedom. So on behalf of everyone here, and I'm sure all Americans, thank you for your service to our country. And now we will begin the program in honor of the 103rd birthday of Ronald Wilson Reagan. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the, the March On of the Colors, playing of our national anthem and the invocation by Chaplain Wayne McCrae, Captain, Chaplain Corps, United States Navy.
March on the colors!
Would you please bow your heads with me for prayer? Eternal Father, we give you thanks for life and liberty. We value these gifts as expressions of your love and as blessings to be cherished in this great nation of ours. We thank you for faithful individuals you have raised up throughout our history, individuals who understood their role of being guardians of the sacred principles of this great nation. And on this morning in particular, we thank you for President Ronald Reagan, a man whose life was governed by you, who sought to be honest, truthful, diligent, fair, and just to all, who challenged us as a nation to be the best that we could be. President Reagan subscribed to the high ideals of being true in his dealings with others, to bear no malice or hatred in his heart, to not covet what others had, but to learn and to labor diligently to provide for his own, and to exercise faithfully that station in life that God Almighty was pleased to call him to. This servant of yours, Father, had the boldness to believe that each American should have the liberty, without hindrance, to become what you have made him or her to be, and to work out happiness for themselves. Lord God, we as a people are blessed by the leadership exercised through President Reagan and his faithful devotion to the sacred principles of this nation. We thank you for his life and seek your blessing in sustaining his legacy. Amen.
Please be seated. It's now my honor to introduce the commanding officer of Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. Brigadier General Bullard has had a most distinguished career in the United States Marine Corps. He served in top positions of leadership in multiple forward deployments, from Desert Storm to Iraqi freedom, as well as humanitarian relief efforts following Hurricane Katrina and Cyclone Sidr in Bangladesh. Early in his career, during the Reagan administration, he was aboard the USS Guadalcanal, where he participated in operations against Libya in 1986. Please welcome Brigadier General John Bullard, Jr.
Mr. Bennett, Mr. Ryan, it's a privilege to be serving today here as the presidential representative. On behalf of the Marines and sailors of Camp Pendleton, thank you for including us in such a special ceremony that honors such a great man and leader. Many of the Marines that are positioned around you today are too young to remember the times when President Reagan was then our Commander-in-Chief. Like Mr. Ryan had mentioned earlier, I had the honor to serve under President Reagan in the first 6 years of my Marine Corps career. Operations in the Gulf of Sidra at the time when Gaddafi drew his line of death and dared us not to cross, as well as the strikes against Tripoli and Benghazi. And then a little later on in '87, when then again Iran threatened freedom of navigation at the seas. And we had reflagged the Kuwaiti tankers and kept Iran at bay to guarantee that commerce throughout the world. As a nation and a Marine Corps, we owe them gratitude for strengthening our military that had been through some difficult times in the decades past. The Marines that are here today represent the thousands of Marines that are deployed throughout the globe. They are standing watch to respond to crisis as our nation's force and readiness, as well as being prepared to go in harm's way in very dangerous places. Early in President Reagan's term of office, he was then shot by would-be assassin John Hinckley Jr. Early in his term, he demonstrated that courage, that same courage that we expect of the men and women in uniform. He stood back up to serve a remaining 2 terms. Just like many of the Marines and other service members throughout the world that have been wounded at war and have gone back and served in multiple deployments. President Reagan always had a way with words. He just had those quick little one-liners that could bring a smile to many people's faces. And on that dreadful day when he arrived in the hospital, the doctors and nurses are surrounding him, and everybody's worried about his life. He solemnly looks up at them and says, "Please tell me all of you are Republicans." President Reagan embodied that selfless service. At an age when people are looking forward to its retirement, he went on to serve 2 terms. And this commitment and service is like the men and women in uniform since the attacks on our great nation since 9/11 have gone out, volunteered, and put themselves in harm's way, some of which paid the ultimate sacrifice. We can't even begin to count the number of people throughout the world that President Reagan's life had touched by giving them freedom and for what he's done. He was a visionary, and he serves as an example for generations to come. President Reagan left the Marine Corps with one of his lasting quotes that's written on the walls of our museum in Quantico. And it says, "Some people spend an entire lifetime wondering if they've made a difference in this world, but the Marines don't have that problem." We thank our Commander-in-Chief. God bless, Semper Fi.
Thank you, sir. Well, thank you, General Bullard. Thank all of you for being part of Ronald Reagan's 103rd birthday, or as I think President Reagan would describe it, the 64th anniversary of his 39th birthday. It wasn't long ago that we celebrated Ronald Reagan's 100th birthday at this very spot. It was the culmination of a year-long national and international celebration of President Reagan's life and achievements. His rise from modest beginnings to the height of his profession, his entry into politics, his governorship, and of course his presidency. Here and overseas, citizens and nations paid tribute to his leadership in reviving the American economy, winning the Cold War, inaugurating a new era of peace among nations, and restoring America's spirit. But we all know that if he were with us here today, President Reagan himself would say, "It's not a story about one man, it's a great American story. A story of ordinary men and women being called upon to meet extraordinary challenges." He would say, "His story is one you see unfolding every day in every town and city, in every school and office and factory, across the country, in every home and shop where free people live and work and dream big dreams." The purpose of the Reagan Presidential Library is not so much to look back, but to look forward. As Ronald Reagan always made clear, the library and the mission it supports should not just be about the success of the past, but about the promise of the future. It was his dream that this library would serve as an inspiration to young people, a place they might learn from his leadership and share his vision, a timeless vision of hope and optimism for America, and his belief that our best days lie ahead. President Reagan's legacy is one of civility and respect. And while, yes, he had deep core beliefs, he fought hard, he played to win, and did his utmost to defeat his opponents, but never to destroy them. At the end of the day, he showed that he could get together with his political adversaries in an atmosphere of goodwill and mutual respect, and the nation was all the better because of that. President Reagan wanted his presidential library to reflect his strong belief in the importance of teaching our children what America is and what it represents in the long history of the world. He wanted to make sure we did a better job of getting across to our children that America is freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of enterprise. As President Reagan told us, freedom is special and rare, and it needs protection. It was President Reagan's wish that his foundation be dedicated to education, what he called informed patriotism. And here at the library, we have embraced President Reagan's challenge to teach our children all that we can about our freedom and how to become informed patriots. Through the Air Force One Pavilion, through having a permanent display of a section of the Berlin Wall, through museum exhibits that follow President Reagan's life and presidency, through our lectures, school tours, conferences, and debates, through all of this and so many other ways as well, we've created a living classroom dedicated to understanding the American experience, American achievement, and the meaning of freedom. And so it is with particular pleasure that we welcome for this Ronald Reagan birthday address, one of the nation's great teachers of informed patriotism, William J. Bennett. From 1985 to 88, he was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Education, giving K through 12 education reform such a push that it has never lost its forward momentum. He advocated competency testing for teachers, holding educators accountable for how much students learn, parental choice of schools, and teaching children the accomplishments of Western civilization and the American nation. From 1989 to 90, as National Drug Czar under Bush 41, he focused on teaching America's youth the dangers of narcotics. Today, he's the author of 20 books. And speaking of authors, we're delighted that Bill Bennett's wife, Elaine Bennett, is with us today. In addition to being the founder and president of the Best Friends Foundation, she is the author of a fantastic new book just released this week called Daughters in Danger. And I would urge everyone to take a look at that. And to round out the Bennett family, their son Joe is with us today. Joe is a scholar athlete from the Princeton class of 2011, and today serves proudly in the United States Marine Corps. And he will be one of the Marines presenting the wreath at President Reagan's memorial. So please join me in welcoming Secretary Bill Bennett.
Well done, Fred. Excellent. And General, excellent. Always think in these moments, Ronald Reagan, memory of Ronald Reagan, what he would say if he were here. He'd make a joke. I was trying to come up with them. I'm not as good as Reagan, but I think he might say something like, if you said to him today, what would you say now to those doctors, looking up at them? And I think President Reagan might say, gee, Nancy, I sure hope our application on healthcare.gov got through. All right. Thanks. Can't resist. This is personal. Ronald Reagan, as I knew him. You wrote us that extraordinary letter in your own hand to let us know that you were falling victim to Alzheimer's. You spoke of other families suffering with the disease. You worried about your wife. Then you chose these words to comfort the nation. I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead. Well, there you go again, I thought, showing us the way. You always had that capacity, Mr. President, not just because you're a natural leader, but because of your great personal strength. My mind went back to a day when we were all picking up our papers and leaving the table after a cabinet meeting, and I literally bumped into you. Now, I'm a pretty big guy, but it was like bumping into a redwood. And it struck me at the time, that's a redwood, inside and outside. Solid in your stance, solid in your beliefs. Your critics always said you were not a detail man. Thank you for that. What great leader is. There are plenty of people to handle the details. You knew instinctively that the president must above all lead. George Will said of you, he was the steadying captain of our clipper ship on stormy seas. He calmed the passengers and the sea. I've been following your path for many years, from the day you invited me to come to Washington to be chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I crossed my fingers, packed up, and moved from North Carolina. But I soon fixed that by moving the best of North Carolina up to me in marriage. Soviet missiles were then pointed at America and at Western Europe. The Red Army was fighting in Afghanistan. The Kremlin dominated millions around the world. And many thought communism was simply unstoppable. But you proclaimed, no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women. And you meant it. You identified publicly the evil empire, and in doing so, you rearmed a Western alliance as a moral force. Experts thought you were rash, that your words were dangerous, but you were proved right. You rebuilt America's military and sent Pershing missiles to Western Europe and countered a Soviet missile buildup. You supported Afghan freedom fighters, making the Soviets pay dearly for their invasion. And you strengthened the voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty. From Ukraine to China, people turned on their shortwave radios. We sent them the Federalist Papers, and they heard the truth about democracy and free markets. And in the most daring decision of all, you announced that we would begin developing a defense against nuclear missiles. You dismissed the long-accepted policy of mad, mutually assured destruction, which depended on the threat of massive nuclear retaliation to prevent war. SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, was an act of faith in the innovative genius that freedom fosters. And with it, you quite literally scared the hell out of the Kremlin. SDI met vicious opposition. A campaign against Star Wars was drummed up. The media loved it. And at the summit in Reykjavik, Iceland, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev insisted that he would not make any concessions on strategic arms cuts unless we gave up SDI testing. Your reaction was pure Reagan, pure American. This meeting is over, you said to your Secretary of State, George Shultz. The diplomats wrung their hands. They didn't know that in that moment, as Charlie Wick told you in the plane on the way back, you had won the Cold War. Back in Moscow, the generals, the Politburo members, the apparatchiks knew they could not win a technological race with America. They could not build up their conventional military forces and provide for their people at the same time. The Soviets simply could not compete with us, the arsenal of democracy, and with SDI. You knew it, and they knew it, and Gorbachev knew it. The Soviet facade began to crack. You decided to widen that crack with a challenge in that speech in West Berlin. Again, don't rock the boat, State Department advised. Don't make the Soviets mad, your own advisors agreed. Don't call them names, said the media. You ignored them, and you wrote about the wall in your speech. Speechwriters, some of them, took it out. You put it back. Speechwriters left it in. Some of the high-ranking officials took it out. Air Force One was on its way to West Berlin when the National Security Council gave you a final version. Again, sanitized. The part about the wall missing. The Reagan part missing. You pursed your lips in that familiar way. You cocked your head and you said, well, I think I'll just stick to my original. The next afternoon, you stood at the Brandenburg Gate. You looked toward East Germany and you demanded, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Then you publicly predicted that this wall will fall. It did, taking down Soviet communism with it. Within 4 years, you were walking through the streets of Moscow as crowds of people chanted, USA, USA, and they were elbowing for a sight of you. At home, too, we thank you. We thank you for believing in us at home once again. When you came to the White House, we were sinking in a sea of high taxes, high interest rates, and low morale. Politicians and pundits alike told us that we had to resign ourselves to a new era of limits. You were undaunted. With an utter faith that government was the problem and not the solution, and a firm grasp of the only economics lesson worth learning, free enterprise works, you released our creative energies and our entrepreneurial spirit. You cut the highest income tax rate from 70% to 33%. You energized investment by cutting the capital gains taxes. And you brought tax relief to every single income group. What was the result? The longest peacetime rise in prosperity in the nation's history. During your presidency, interest rates dropped sharply, and inflation was slashed to less than 3%. 20 million new jobs were created, most of them in the higher skilled, higher tech, higher paying industries. The average American family had thousands of dollars more a year to spend for its own needs and not to give to the IRS. And thank you too, Mr. President, for for creating for us an ideal of the way the presidency should be carried on and how it should be worn with a jacket on in the office. Your manner sprang from the fact that even though you were president, you were always yourself. You never had to prove anything. I'll never forget the day you phoned me when I was Secretary of Education. The call came in out of the blue. "Hello, Bill," came your voice. "I'm sorry to interrupt you." "No problem, Mr. President." Let me get my feet off the desk, get this newspaper down. "Bill, do you know a certain poem that pays tribute to teachers?" you asked me. Described the poem, and I said, no, I wasn't familiar with it. "Well, let me get it to you," the president said. I thought he'd get some aide to look it up, copy it, and fax it to my office. But no, Ronald Reagan copied it out longhand on a sheet of yellow paper. He did it, of course, from memory and sent it over as if he were a neighbor eager to share something. It was Iowa Clark Mullenhough's poem, "The Teacher." Congressman Dana Rohrabacher remembers a moment when, back as a young campaign staffer in California, he was accompanying you and you were giving a whistle-stop speech. There was a small group of blind children in the crowd. The teacher asked if you could greet the children. "Sure," you said, "but not with the photographers or reporters around." After the press had left, Rohrabacher saw you go to the children and shake their hands. Then you knelt down so they could see you by touching your face. What politician can you think of who would not have given $1 million to have the press get pictures of him in a scene like that, marveled Rohrabacher, but not Reagan. Finally, Mr. President, thank you for being there when the nation needed your hope, your courage, and sometimes just your reassurance. When the Challenger astronauts died before our very eyes in 1986, you put a comforting hand on our shoulders and spoke to us. I knew those astronauts. The President and Vice President Bush announced that while teacher Kristen McAuliffe was in space, I would be substitute teaching her class in New Hampshire. Good job for the Secretary of Education. Let's see if he can actually teach. You said to us, "I know it's hard to understand that sometimes painful things like this happen, but it's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted, it belongs to the brave." And then you reminded us, as only you could, of their final destination. You said this, "The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us by the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them. This morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God." To slip the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. In your last letter to us, Mr. President, you reminded us again of the bonds of faith, courage, and affection that unite us when you wrote, "When the Lord calls me home, I will leave with the greatest love for this country of ours and eternal optimism for its future." And in your last speech, your farewell address, as Fred just reminded us, you reminded us of patriotism, and that patriotism is not a down-market commodity. Our American freedom, you said, is special. It's rare. It's fragile. It needs protection. And then you reminded us of who we are. And you took as your example men in uniform, men like those Marines here today. These were Navy men, but close enough, guys. Get an argument going later. You recalled one of your favorite stories. Quote, "It was back in the early 80s at the height of the boat people, and the sailor was hard at work on the carrier Midway, patrolling the South China Sea. This sailor, like most American servicemen, was young, smart, and fiercely observant. The crew spied on the horizon a leaky little boat, and crammed inside were refugees from Indochina, hoping to get to America. The Midway sent a small launch to bring them to the ship and to safety. As the refugees made their way through the choppy seas, one spied the sailor on deck and stood up, and the refugee called out to him, The sailor could barely make it out, but finally he could tell the rest of his men on the ship what the refugee was saying. The refugee was yelling, "Hello, hello, American sailor. Hello, freedom man. Hello, freedom man." Yes, sir. That's you, sir. Freedom man. Thank you, Mr. President. Happy birthday, Mr. President. God bless you, Mr. President. Rest in peace, Mr. President. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Secretary Bennett, for those gracious and thoughtful remarks. Now I'd like to ask you all to please rise. Timing is everything. We will now have the laying of the wreath and honors to President Reagan.
Honor guard! Attention! Halt! Attention to orders!
You're right, yes, sir. Thank you. The President of the United States has directed that a presidential wreath be laid at the resting place of all former presidents on the anniversary of their birth. Brigadier General John W. Bullard, Jr., Commanding Officer, Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, is designated to place a wreath at the tomb of the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Wilson Reagan, on 6 February 2014, in honor of the 103rd anniversary of his birth and in tribute to his distinguished service to a grateful nation.
Honor guard! Present! Oh!
I ask you to please remain standing for the retiring of the colors.
Return the colors!
Please join me in another round of applause for the Marine Band. Well, this will conclude our official ceremony for today. I want to thank all of you for being here and for being part of this program. And I'm pleased to announce that birthday cake is served in the lobby of the Presidential Library, so please enjoy. Thank you all.